Went through our community's latest 2025 fantasy football mock draft and identified the best wide receiver to draft in every single round of 2025 fantasy football mock drafts. These are the wide receivers that are going to bring you the most consistency and the most upside at the same time and help you guys both dominate and win your 2025 fantasy football leagues. All right, let's start with the first round. And obviously, we could talk about any single given wide receiver here. And you guys have heard me talk a lot about Malik Neighbors in the first round throughout the offseason. But I want to talk about Nico Collins for the purpose of today's video. It's easy to forget that Nico Collins was on an absolute monster pace to start the 2024 fantasy football season. He had 27.5 or more fantasy points in 2 of the first 5 games and 15.8 or more fantasy points in 4 of the first 5 games on the season before he was injured in that week 5 game against Buffalo. He only had 2 catches in that game and still had 15.8 fantasy points. And overall, you look throughout the rest of the season, in terms of the games given in the fantasy season, Nico Collins only gave you single digits twice throughout the year, and then he did miss week 6 through 10. Every other game on the year last year, he gave you double-digit fantasy performances, and he averaged 17.6 fantasy points per game. Finished the year as the wide receiver 23, only playing in 12 fantasy games, but over 1,000 receiving yards, 14.7 yards per catch, and 7 receiving touchdowns. There's no reason to think that he's not going to do that this year, that he can't play a full season and have an even better fantasy season overall. I think he's been a little bit overshadowed by maybe someone like the upside that other players bring in the first round, I guess you could argue, or maybe some of the recency bias based on what we saw in more games played by other elite wide receivers in the first round. But Nico Collins should be up there with the very best wide receivers that you can select in the first round going into 2025. I know that the Texans brought him, some competition at the wide receiver position, both through free agency and Christian Kirk, and then with 2 rookie wide receivers via the draft. And we have the departure of Tank Dell for at least this season after that gruesome injury he had at the end of last year. And then everybody's favorite boatman, Stephon Diggs, who is now with the New England Patriots at the wide receiver position, Dalton Schultz at tight end, and then we've got Joe Mixon as well as Nick Chubb in terms of the run game, not really like elite pass catching backs at this point in their career. So there's going to be a massive amount of targets for Nico Collins. He is set for a massive fantasy season. I just want you guys to imagine if Nico Collins did not get hurt last year, what his numbers would have looked like at the end of 2024. And regardless, he still had a fantastic 2024 fantasy football campaign. So I am smashing the draft button on Nico Collins as often as I can in the first round of 2025 fantasy football mock drafts. All right, let's look to the second round. And you guys have heard me talk a lot about Garrett Wilson. He did go at the end of the second round here. You guys have heard me go on a lot of rants about A.J. Brown, who I still like. Love Ladd McConkey, love Drake London, but you guys know that I'm going to have no choice but to talk about Brian Thomas Jr., who you could argue is a player who goes in the first round. His ADP on Sleeper is sitting at 12.7 overall. So it kind of depends on the draft that you're in. You will at times see Brian Thomas Jr. in the first round and at times in the second round. But for the purpose of today's video, we're going to talk about him as a second round player. Brian Thomas Jr. finished last year as the wide receiver 4 in PPR, averaging 16.7 fantasy points per game, 133 targets, 87 catches, just over 1,200 receiving yards, and 10 receiving touchdowns, 14.7 yards per catch. Got a little bit of Trevor Lawrence, got a little bit of Mac Jones. Nonetheless, had a fantastic rookie campaign, and I don't really understand why Brian Thomas Jr. is not consistently being looked at as one of these elite tier wide receivers. He's kind of just in between that elite tier wide receivers that we see in the first round and then the wide receivers that we see in the second round. And then this kind of depends on people's personal opinion of Brian Thomas Jr. There's been a lot of buzz about BTJ, don't get me wrong, but there's also been naysayers, and I just really don't understand it. This is the wide receiver 4 last year, and I know that they went out and drafted Travis Hunter and in terms of volume, we're not exactly sure what we're going to get out of Travis Hunter this year, how many snaps he's going to play at wide receiver, how many snaps he's going to play at corner, but he will have an impact in terms of target share in this offense. But we have also seen Christian Kirk depart from this offense and Evan Ingram depart from this offense. And there's a lot of vacated targets here for Brian Thomas Jr. And even if Travis Hunter takes up some of that, I'm not worried about it whatsoever. I know they went out and acquired Dewami Brown from the Washington Commanders, or previously with the Washington Commanders via free agency, but there's just nothing here that doesn't scream a massive amount of targets, true wide receiver one for Brian Thomas Jr., and a massive amount of upside going into the 2025 season. We look back to last year, just 4 games with single-digit fantasy performances. Every other game, double digits, and this was an absolute league winner. 32.5 fantasy points in week 15, 28.2 in week 16, 23.9 in week 17. Brian Thomas Jr. won you guys fantasy championships last year and helped you guys cruise through the fantasy playoffs. And I think he's going to be a player in 2025 who absolutely helps you guys cruise through the fantasy season and dominate week in and week out. Do not be afraid to smash the draft button on Brian Thomas Jr. in both the first round, but also the second round. I think he's an absolute steal at an ADP where he lands in the second round of 2025 fantasy football mock drafts. Let's take a look at the third round. I think this is a very strong tier of wide receivers. JSN, Rashee Rice, Scary Terry, even Tyreek Hill I still think has some upside at this ADP. T. Higgins, Marvin Harrison Jr., who I think MH Jr.'s value to me is really starting to look like an absolute steal. Almost used him for this video. Devontae Adams I like a lot. Mike Evans I like a lot. But if you guys have been following the channel this offseason, you already know that we're going to talk about T. Higgins, who averaged 18.5 fantasy points per game in 2024. I just think there's so much upside with T. Higgins here. It's hard for me to pass up on him when he's sitting there in the middle of the third round. He's tied to Joe Burrow. He's going to have Jamar Chase on the field, taking away a massive amount of that defensive pressure, right? This is just one of those offenses that it's almost impossible to line up against these two wide receivers and not expect one or the other to go off on a consistent basis, and these guys do go off on a consistent basis. And like many of us know, especially thanks to the front office of the Bengals, this defense is not looking much more promising than last season. The Bengals are going to have to throw the football quite a bit. And I know the knock on T. Higgins. It's the amount of playing time that he actually gives you. He's only played 12 games in each of the last 2 seasons, but I'll take it in the third round for the amount of upside that he does give you when he is on the field. We look at last year in games that T. Higgins did play. Like I said, only played through 12 games, but in games that he did play, just 2 games with single-digit fantasy performances. Every other game, excluding 2, he had 18.2 or more fantasy games. We have a week 4 performance with 12 fantasy points, week 6, 14.7. Every other game, it's actually 17.9 or more, close enough. You guys get the picture. A massive amount of upside, and once again, a fantastic player through the fantasy playoffs. 19.8 fantasy points in week 15, 19.8 in week 16, 40.1 in week 17. It was a must-win game for the Bengals. Don't get me wrong. Complete shootout between the Bengals and the Broncos. Nonetheless, it doesn't matter. This was a league winner last year. I love the upside here. Like I said, I really like Marvin Harrison Jr.'s value in the third round as well, but I'll take the upside with T. Higgins in 2025 fantasy football mock drafts when we're looking at the third round. All right, moving along to the fourth round. I think this is like a solid tier of wide receiver. I still like DJ Moore where he's going. I like DK Metcalf now that we know for sure Aaron Rodgers is going to be there. Cortland Sutton, I like a lot. Ted McMillan, I think, is perfectly fine here. But I'm going to cheat a little. And we're going to talk about Devonta Smith, who went at the 5.2, because I think that Devonta Smith is still easily in this range of wide receivers, and I do see him go at the end of the fourth in enough mock drafts. But I think I can cheat here and talk about Devonta Smith. And you guys, if you follow the channel, you know that I go on a lot of rants about a lot of the Eagles players. It feels like last offseason I was doing this about Devonta Smith, A.J. Brown, Saquon Barkley, Jalen Hurts throughout the regular season last year. And a lot of the videos we were talking about those 4 players. And here we are again, another offseason where I'm at least making a strong argument time in and time out for Devonta Smith, A.J. Brown, and Jalen Hurts going into 2025. And for me, Devonta Smith is just that model of consistency when it comes to fantasy football. 7 or more receiving touchdowns in 3 straight seasons, 1,000 or more receiving yards in 2 of the last 3 years, but he only played in 13 games last year, did deal with some injury mid-season last year, and you look at the pace he was on, he would have easily eclipsed 1,000 receiving yards last year as well. He's averaged 14.2 or more fantasy points in 3 straight years, and last year was actually his highest fantasy points per game total with 15.3 fantasy points per game in the 2024 fantasy football season. And I just think that Devonta Smith, year in, year out, you know what you're going to get. Maybe there's not a ton of upside here because Eagles only have to throw the football so much. We got Barkley, we got Hurts running at the goal line, all that stuff. A.J. Brown still the wide receiver 1 here. They get Dallas Goedert a little bit involved, who they just signed to an extension. But Devonta Smith is still going to bring you that safe floor every single week. So I just think when you have him on your team, you just don't have to worry. Couple duds last year, week 7, 0.8 fantasy points. And this is something I always talk about with Devonta Smith. For some reason, we do always get like that one game out of Devonta Smith where he gives you a complete dud. And it's probably for those reasons that we just talked about. That was also against the Giants. It wasn't a super competitive game. 3.4 points in week 10 against Dallas, 6.9 in week 11 against Washington. But every other game that Devonta Smith played in last year, he gave you double-digit fantasy points. Once again, another league winner last year, right? 28 fantasy points in week 15, 11.1 in week 16, good enough for a flex play, which at this point is what we're looking at, right? And 30 fantasy points in week 17 against Dallas. Devonta Smith is just a player who I think is the perfect model of consistency, the perfect type of flex player in full PPR leagues. And I think he's a steal around that end of the 4th round, beginning of the 5th round range in fantasy football drafts. A player that you can depend on year in and year out. I am perfectly fine with Devonta Smith being the player who we talk about for the 5th round of 2025 fantasy football mock drafts for today's video. All right, so we're going to stay in the 5th round here, and I do think this is a really solid tier wide receivers once again. Xavier Worthy, Jamison Williams, Zay Flowers, Jalen Waddle, I'm not crazy high on, Jerry Jeudy, George Pickens. There's a lot of upside across the board here, and I have talked a lot about Xavier Worthy throughout the offseason. I do really like George Pickens here. I think Judy's perfectly fine. Like I said, not so high on Waddle. Flowers, I think, is fine, but not as much upside as the other guys here, but I'm going to talk about Jamison Williams. This is a player who there's just way too much upside, in my opinion, to pass on Jamison Williams when we're at this range in the draft. And I think it's just really interesting that Jamison Williams is kind of being like pushed back in ADP because of the departure of Ben Johnson. Like that's like the biggest knock I hear about when it comes to Jamison Williams and people not being as high on him. But I just don't personally care. Dave Burkett of the Detroit Free Press has reported that John Morton, the new offensive coordinator of the Lions, is like raving about Jamison Williams, wants to get him heavily involved, and they want to get a lot more of those down the field plays to Jamison Williams, which we did see at times last year, right? And we've seen little spurts in his first 2 seasons with the Lions, but we especially saw last year, right? We want to see those deep throws to Jamison Williams. That is his strength, stretching the field. We're going to get more of that out of Jamison Williams in 2025. We looked at last year, over 1,000 receiving yards, 7 receiving touchdowns, 17.2 yards per catch, and overall average 14.2 fantasy points per game. We finally saw kind of like that breakout season for Jamison Williams. If you guys followed the channel last offseason, this was a player I begged you guys to draft. We kind of predicted that, and I think he's going to be even better going into 2025 and can eclipse a lot of his totals from last year. And, you know, while Jamison Williams is a bit bumpy as a fantasy starter and definitely a player that you wanted in the flex last year, still has a tremendous amount of upside, is still a really fun player to own, and definitely fun when he is giving you those highs. And once again, theme of today's list, this was a league winner last year. 12.7 fantasy points in week 15, 26 in week 16, 24.5 in week 17. So we're expecting big things out of Jamison Williams in this 4th year. 4th year is kind of that sweet spot. is a year where that contract really starts to become under fire. What's going to happen here? It's a good time to draft players when they're in that 4th year or 5th year looking for a new contract. Jameson Williams, I think, is going to have an absolute monster year in 2025 fantasy. It is an absolute steal at this point in fantasy football mock drafts. Let's move along to the 6th round. And once again, I think there's a lot of good value here. I do really like Chris Godwin here. I find myself leaving a lot of mocks with Chris Godwin. We got guys like Travis Hunter, Chris Olave, a lot of people high on Rome Odunze in his sophomore season. I love Calvin Ridley in this range as well. But once again, Jordan Addison is just a player that I feel like I cannot pass up on at this point in mock drafts. He has been in a lot of the videos so far this offseason. He's been a player that I've talked about in a lot of mock drafts, and just a player that I find myself leaving a lot of mock drafts and underdog drafts with at this point in the offseason. We look at Jordan Addison through his first 2 seasons, right? 9 or more receiving touchdowns in each of the 2 years. And while he hasn't eclipsed 1,000 receiving yards in those 2 seasons, right, in his young career, he still is an overall great red zone threat and has averaged 13 or more fantasy points per game in each of the first 2 seasons. And it just hasn't really mattered who the starting quarterback has been. He has found a way to get it done. And I think overall, he and JJ McCarthy are going to find a good chemistry. And once again, one thing that I love with Jordan Addison is that we know at the end of the day, JJ is going to be on the field. Justin Jefferson is going to take away that defensive pressure that opens things up for Jordan Addison. A lot of big plays happen for that reason with Jordan Addison. We look down the stretch, once again, very solid throughout the fantasy playoffs last year, 13.3 in week 15, 14.5 in week 16, 18.9 in week 17. So I think that Addison is a great value at this point in drafts when we're looking at the 6th round. Now, if you're worried about potential suspension for Jordan Addison, which could definitely happen this year, I'm not completely freaking out here. I think, when we look at pure fantasy football, when we have talented players like this who have finished as a top 25 wide receiver 2 years in a row, and they do end up missing 4 games, 6 games, whatever it's going to end up being, well, that just turns them into a good value. Do you have to kind of like plan around that, strategize around that? Sure, you're going to have to, plan on those players missing time. But ultimately, I still think that could be a good thing because I think that could lead to Jordan Addison falling even further in mock drafts and in underdog drafts. So if we do see a suspension come in for Jordan Addison, then go ahead and take the value. Maybe you're going to have to draft an additional wide receiver here or there, or maybe go for a late round gem, and we're going to have plenty of late round gems on this list. But ultimately, I just don't freak out about that. Same thing with like Rashee Rice. If Rashee Rice does get a suspension, misses 4 or 6 games, then that just turns his value in mock drafts a little bit higher for me. Because at the end of the day, you're getting an extreme fantasy talent at a discount in your draft. So I'm not freaking out about a potential suspension for Jordan Addison. The stats are there. Everything's there. There's a lot of hype about JJ McCarthy, his sophomore season, this Kevin O'Connell system, all of that stuff. It worked with Sam Darnold. Probably going to work with JJ McCarthy. This is a pass-first offense. Jordan Addison, in my eyes, is a solidified number 2 target on this team, no matter what. It's JJ Addison. Then we can look at guys like TJ Hawkinson and maybe some of the other wide receivers on this depth chart. But I love Jordan Addison, where he's going in the 6th round of fantasy football mock drafts right now. He might even take a further dip as the offseason goes on. But for now, I'm drafting him confidently in the 6th round. Moving along to the 7th round, once again, a really good tier for me. I think that there are some really interesting players. Jawan Jennings, Jacoby Myers, Jaden Reed, Khalil Shakir, Deebo Samuel. I've talked about a number of these guys throughout the offseason. I think this is a super strong tier of wide receivers. We could argue for any of these players. But if you guys have been following the channel this offseason, you know that I'm going to talk about Jacoby Myers, who I think is one of the best overall values at any position in 2025 fantasy football drafts and mock drafts. So we look at Jacoby Myers in the last 3 seasons. He's averaged 12.9 or more fantasy points per game, 12.9 in 2022, 13.7 2023, and 14.5 last year in 2024 with over 1,000 receiving yards, 4 receiving touchdowns, 11.8 yards per catch, finishing as the wide receiver 19 in full PPR. He's been the wide receiver 28 or better in the last 3 seasons, and he is not being drafted that way, even with a massive upgrade at the quarterback position, going from a combination of Gardner Minshew and Aiden O'Connell to Geno Smith. And I've talked about this in videos throughout the offseason already, but JSN, one of the hottest fantasy football wide receivers right now after his breakout sophomore season. He was supported by Geno Smith last year. There's no reason to think that Geno Smith cannot target Jakobi Meyers as often as he did target JSN last year and support Jakobi Meyers, right? It's kind of an interesting system right now. Like we're seeing, throughout minicamp, the wide receivers be moved around on this team. And, we do have 2 rookie wide receivers and Jack Besh on this team, as well as Donta Thornton, who have made their own buzz throughout the offseason. Going to maybe get some interesting plays out of Trey Tucker. And then, obviously, the elephant in the room is that the true number 1 pass catcher on this team is the tight end, Brock Bowers, right? And then, you could also argue this team is going to run the football more in 2025, of course, with Ashton Genty and then maybe some of the other running backs. We've gotten some coach speak that some of the other running backs will be involved in Ashton Genty's rookie season. But nonetheless, right, Jakobi Meyers is the true wide receiver 1 on this team, and nobody can convince me otherwise. The stats are there for the past couple years. The stats were there last year. And he's being drafted at an ADP of 85.7 on Sleeper, going in the 7th or 8th round of Sleeper mock drafts right now, going very late in Underdog drafts. I think overall, he's one of the best value players, like I said, at any position in fantasy football mock drafts right now. And I absolutely love him at this range in Sleeper mock drafts. I think he is easily the best wide receiver that you guys could target in the 7th round of 2025 fantasy football mock drafts. Moving along to the 8th round, once again, you can make an argument just about for any player here, and I think there's a lot of interesting names. I'm starting to rise a lot on Matthew Golden in this range. Josh Downs, although the quarterback play is looking tricky, could definitely be interesting. I think Diggs has some value. Once again, make an argument for any of these guys, but let's talk about Ricky Pearsall of the San Francisco 49ers. This is a player who we really saw have an interesting rookie season. Obviously, suffered, from getting shot in the offseason. Took a little bit of time to get going. Played in week 7. We had the Brandon Ayuk injury, the Christian McCaffrey injury. This offense was all over the place last year. The offensive line was not great, but we saw little spurts. Week 8, 11.7 fantasy points for Pearsall. Week 10, 17.3. Then in the fantasy championship against Detroit, 28.7 fantasy points. And then, in what was basically a meaningless game in week 18, especially for fantasy, 18.9 fantasy points. But we look going into 2025, where we are expecting Christian McCaffrey to be healthy and play in week 1. We're not expecting Brandon Ayuk to be ready to go. And I do like Jawan Jennings a lot where he's going in drafts right now. And I think he's going to be, heavily involved in this offense throughout the season. I do think that there are other wide receivers behind Jawan Jennings and Ricky Pearsall on this team that could make some buzz at times, like my guy Demarcus Robinson. And then obviously George Kittle is going to get a lot of volume, and Christian McCaffrey at the running back position can still get a lot of passing volume. But I just think that Ricky Pearsall is kind of worth the risk where he's going in drafts right now, because we definitely saw a good connection between him and Brock Purdy at the end of the 2024 season. I think that could absolutely bleed into the 2025 fantasy football season. So a lot of upside here, but I also think that there's just like good consistency, good floor for Ricky Pearsall. I won't be surprised if he kind of brings more of a solid floor throughout the 2025 season, more so than anything. So a lot of good wide receivers in the 8th round, but the player that I kind of find myself leaving the most mock drafts with at the wide receiver position in this range is going to be Ricky Pearsall. Moving into the 9th round, just 4 wide receivers to take a look at: Darnell Mooney, Mika Egbuka, Jaden Higgins, and Christian Kirk. So 2 wide receivers that are rookie prospects, and then 2 that are veteran prospects, right? So you could kind of go with either rookie, I think is fine. I think Christian Kirk, maybe there's an argument for, but Darnell Mooney's got to be the guy for me here. Wide receiver 31 in 2024, 106 targets, 64 catches, 992 receiving yards, 5 receiving touchdowns, 15.5 yards per catch, and average 12.1 fantasy points per game. A bit sporadic, to say the least. We look in terms of double-digit fantasy performances for Mooney last year. Week 2, 17.8, had a long touchdown grab at the end of that game against Philly. 14.6 in Week 3 against Kansas City. 31.5 in Week 5 against Tampa Bay, where everyone and their mother balled out in that game. Then a couple weeks later, 18.6 against Tampa Bay, right? Everyone and their mother also balled out in that game. 19.8 in Week 9, 14.6 in Week 10, 20.2 in Week 14, 13.2 in Week 16. Every other game, he gave you single digits. So definitely sporadic, more of a flex play here. But purely looking at flex plays at this point in drafts. Plus, we got all this buzz. Michael Penix in his sophomore season, we saw good things out of Michael Penix at the end of last year. We know he's going to be the starter here, barring any injury. Drake London's a wide receiver 1. Still got Ray McLeod as the wide receiver 3. Bijan Robinson, Tyler Algier, Kyle Pitts. We know the story of the Falcons offense and what we expect it to be. And while all the buzz is kind of looming towards Bijan Robinson, Drake London, and to a degree Michael Penix, Darnell Mooney is kind of the odd man out here who still had good enough fantasy production in 2024. So do I expect safe floors here? No, but I do think that the ceilings will be high for Darnell Mooney. And yeah, he's always, one of these guys that we talk about in late rounds of mock drafts and regular drafts in the offseason. But hey, that's for a reason. I think that Darnell Mooney is certainly worth the selection for the upside that he gives you as we look at 9th rounds moving into the 2025 fantasy football season. All right, moving into the 10th round, we see Jalen McMillan, Michael Pittman, Luther Burden, Rashid Shaheed, Trey Harris, and Kyle Williams. Once again, I actually think that there's a lot of good value here and a lot of arguments for just about every wide receiver that you guys see here in the 10th round. But I want to talk about another player that always comes up in the offseason, and that is Rashid Shaheed of the New Orleans Saints. Very similar to Darnell Mooney in the sense that I expect a lot of high ceilings out of Rashid Shaheed. I don't quite know what the floor is going to look like. And if we look at Shaheed's numbers last year, the floor was actually pretty dang safe outside of week 3 against Philly. Week 1, 16.3 fantasy points. Week 2, 20.9. Week 3, a goose egg. Week 4, 15.7. Week 5, 18.6. Week 6 got hurt, but off of 7 targets, somehow only had 1 catch, but 8.3 fantasy points and a touchdown in terms of the special teams, right? But all the reports are indicating that Rashid Shaheed is back to full health. He didn't play after week 6 of last year, and that he's going to be ready to go week 1. But the elephant in the room is, what is this offense exactly going to be? Tyler Shuck, Spencer Rattler at quarterback. See what happens. I mean, Shuck has a little bit of promising degree, but outside of that, we just don't really know what we're going to get in terms of quarterback play at all. Kamara is the RB1 here. Then Chris Olave has been a full participant throughout OTA so far, but of course, there's some concern there. Is he going to really be able to line up for a full season? If he gets a concussion, what is his career going to look like? But there's also a world where Chris Olave is perfectly fine throughout this entire season, which I actually think would be a good thing for Rashid Shaheed. Less defensive pressure, and it'll give Shaheed the ability to do more of what he does best, which is stretch the field and get those big upside down the field plays. Brandon Cooks back at the wide receiver position. They have a lot of injuries at the tight end position between Juwan Johnson, Foster Moreau, and everyone's favorite veteran, Taysom Hill. But this moral of the story here is that you're getting a ton of upside on a cheap draft pick, and the numbers were actually quite good for Shaheed, averaging 13.6 fantasy points last year through 6 games. So I would take the dart throw here. I would take the upside on Rashid Shaheed, and I always say it, bad offenses still produce good fantasy players. So even if the quarterback play is washy next year, you could be looking at some pretty good value here in the 10th round. And hey, bad teams on paper do surprise us at times. So Shaheed could end up being a fantastic value in 2025 drafts. Moving along to the 11th round, couple wide receivers here. Rookie Jack Bech, Rondell Robinson, Rashad Bateman, Marvin Mims. And I do like Marvin Mims a lot at this point in drafts. I like Robinson as well. If you guys have been following the channel this offseason, you know that Rashad Bateman is my guy at this point in drafts. Really promising to see the Ravens sign him to a 3-year extension coming out of his 4th season where he was the wide receiver 40 in full PPR, 756 receiving yards, 9 receiving touchdowns, 16.8 yards per catch, and 10.3 fantasy points per game. So once again, I don't expect really a lot of consistency here, great floors, but the upside is there. We looked to last year, right? It was a bit up and down, but he gave you double digits in week 3, week 5, week 6, week 7, week 10, week 12, as well as week 18, if for some reason he played in week 18. But outside of that, single digits in every other game. Nonetheless, this isn't a extremely like pass heavy offense, but Rashad Bateman is locked in as a wide receiver 2 here. Zay Flowers a wide receiver 1, then Bateman, then DeAndre Hopkins, then a lot of question marks. Then we got the 2 tight ends and Mark Andrews and Isaiah Likely, as well as the fact that this team will run the football first and foremost between Lamar Jackson and Derrick Henry, maybe some pass volume to a guy like Justice Hill. But nonetheless, I just think he's a great value. Like I said, he finished as a wide receiver 40, not being drafted that way. It's a wide receiver 40, great. No, but we are in the 11th round at this point. He's sitting on an ADP of 163.1 overall on the Sleeper app, locked in as a wide receiver 2. Once again, we're going for ceilings at this point. We're going for upside, taking some dart throws. If Rashad Bateman is there in the 11th round and you are searching for wide receiver value, I think this is absolutely the player that you need to draft at this point in 2025 fantasy mock drafts. All right, looking to the 12th round, just 3 wide receivers. Quentin Johnston, Keenan Allen, not on a team. Quentin Johnston, I actually still think that the story's not completely over there. Call me crazy, but you look to last year, there were some moments. And Hollywood Brown, who's going to be the wide receiver that we do talk about. Listen, this Chiefs offense really interesting going into next year. Okay, they were not healthy last year. The offensive line play was not great. We saw injuries to Isaiah Pacheco, Rashee Rice, Hollywood Brown before the season even started. We saw kind of a decline, so to speak, for Travis Kelce, who was still not that bad last year, just bad based on what we expect out of him. Then he had all the Taylor Swift drama, and just everyone hates the Chiefs now, and everyone tied to them, but. For reference, Kelce was the tight end 5 last year in fantasy, still had over 800 receiving yards, 3 touchdowns. But I think that this offense is going to click on more cylinders this year, barring injuries again, right? But if we look at this offense lineup with Mahomes, with Pacheco and Hunt, and even Elijah Mitchell at running back, then Rashee Rice, Xavier Worthy, Hollywood Brown, all healthy, with Travis Kelce and Noah Gray, who also had moments at the tight end position last year. I think that this offense is going to be a lot more fluent in 2025 and remind us of, what we're used to in terms of fantasy production out of the Chiefs offense throughout the regular season. And once again, this could be a defensive nightmare if we get a healthy Rashee Rice, Xavier Worthy, and Hollywood Brown all on the field. Now, Hollywood Brown is age 28 going into his 7th season. Like, I understand he's not exactly what we got out of some of the younger seasons out of Hollywood Brown. He's always been a bit sporadic, but once again, we're taking dart throws here. We're looking for upside. I think he could have a lot of good spike weeks. And if we do see a suspension to Rashee Rice, then I think we could get some early good production out of Hollywood Brown as well that could carry over into the rest of the regular season. So playing a little bit of a hypothetical here, but overall, at the end of the day, I don't think it's crazy to say that if last season we didn't see injuries to 3 of the primary starters on this offense going into the 2024 season, that we would have seen a much different Chiefs offense throughout the season. So I'm willing to take the dart throw if you need wide receiver help at this point in fantasy drafts every single time on Hollywood Brown. All right, last but not least, let's look at the 13th round. Just 2 wide receivers, Cedric Tillman or Adam Thielen. I think that Thielen will still have a role in that offense. Don't get me wrong, but we're going to talk about Cedric Tillman, who I think is just once again a player who we can look at as a high ceiling selection who brings you a lot of upside. Week 7 through 9 last year was on an absolute tear. 18.1 fantasy points in week 7, 28.9 in week 8, 19.5 in week 9. I remember getting questions that were absolutely crazy. Should I start AJ Brown or Cedric Tillman? I start Puka Nacua or Cedric Tillman. He was being talked about as a fantasy savior last year. And then things started to quickly decline in week 11, 7.7 fantasy points after a bye week in week 10, and then got hurt in week 12 against Pittsburgh, just 2.8 fantasy points before missing the rest of the season. And listen, once again, quarterback situation here, very washy. Joe Flacco, Kenny Pickett, Dylan Gabriel, Shadur Sanders. What are we going to get? I have no idea, right? Jerry Jeudy's a locked-in wide receiver 1 here. Outside of that, I'm not really worried about guys like David Bell or Deontay Johnson. You still got Njoku at the tight end position, then kind of a different run game with rookie Quinton Judkins, and Dylan Sampson, and Jerome Ford still on this team. Don't know what we're going to get whatsoever out of this offense, but at this point in mock drafts, the most upside purely lies with Cedric Tillman. Once again, high ceilings. We're taking a dart throw. At this point in mock drafts, as Cedric Tillman is on the board, I think he's 110% worth the selection as we start to move into 2025 fantasy football season. I'll do it for today's video. There is every wide receiver that you have to draft in every round of 2025 fantasy football mock drafts. If you guys are new to the channel, this is all we do here all year long. Free fantasy football content, redraft, dynasty, and best ball. If you guys are into that, be sure to hit that subscribe button on the way out. But most importantly, if you guys have any fantasy football questions whatsoever, redraft, dynasty, or best ball, drop them down below. I'll get back to every comment on this video. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.